Hey everyone, this week we're going to be talking about boundaries. Do you know what those are? Do you know why they're important? Do you have boundaries? Do you know how to set boundaries? We are going to be talking about all of that on this week's Mental Health Minute with Kim. We teach people how to treat us. I heard that saying one time and I thought that is a really good one to use when I'm teaching people about boundaries. And it's very true. If we let people get away with things and treat us a certain way, then they come to expect that. And it's not healthy to not have any boundaries with people. We have to respect ourselves in order for other people to respect us as well. And one way to do that is to set boundaries. Now, boundaries can be thought of as rules. So these are the rules that we set in order for people to be in our lives, and we have to stick by those rules. Otherwise, we end up having toxic people in our lives, and it's hard sometimes to get them out if we don't have good boundaries. And we don't just have the same boundaries for everyone. Our boundaries might be a little looser with some people. For example, I have very good boundaries in my mental health practice. I have to for clients, for their own mental health and for mine, and to be ethical and treat people in an ethical way. But I might have a little bit looser boundaries with, say, a family member. And that's okay. And our boundaries can fluctuate a little bit depending on what the circumstances are. So there are some good steps to setting boundaries. And also keep in mind, we can have boundaries for ourselves and boundaries that we have with other people. So I am going to walk you through the steps of setting a boundary and then give you an example of how I set a boundary in my own life so you can see it in practice. So the first thing with setting boundaries that we need to do is figure out what some of our core values are. And below is a link to a really good website that has a list of core values, and you can just use it as a jumping off point. You may already know what some of your core values are, but it's important to figure out what your core values are. Otherwise, you can't figure out what boundaries to set. So number one, figure out what your core values are. Number two is to figure out what a boundary could be, or boundaries could be, based on those core values. Number three is to figure out what the consequences are going to be if somebody crosses that boundary. And it's really important to set a consequence, because if you don't, then you're just going to let people continue to walk all over you. Number four is to communicate the boundary to the other person or the other people. How will they know what your boundaries are if you don't tell them what they are? So you have to communicate what those boundaries are. And finally, number five is to stick by the consequences, because again, if we don't stick by the consequences, people are going to walk all over us, and then we're going to feel bad about ourselves and end up being in toxic relationships. So I'm going to walk you through how I set a boundary with my niece and nephews. So they like to come up to my living space and just chill out with me, maybe talk or play video games, or just have what I call quality ignoring time, where we sit around and do our own different things, but we're sharing space together. So one of my core values is safety. Another one is consistency. So based on those core values, I set a boundary of no fighting in my space, because I want it to be a safe space, and I want to keep it consistent so that they know that it is a safe space where they can come up and just be themselves. So the boundary is no fighting. The consequence for crossing that boundary or not respecting it is that they won't get to come up and sit with me in my space. They'll have to stay downstairs. So I communicated that boundary with them, told them what the consequence was, and I uphold the boundary and the consequences for it. So now they understand that if they start fighting or wrestling around upstairs or roughhousing, and it starts to feel like not a safe space, that they have to go downstairs. And in fact, If they start to argue or roughhouse or whatever, one of them will say, let's take this downstairs, because they know that they won't be able to be upstairs for a certain amount of time if they cross that boundary. So that is setting a boundary with other people. Now, setting up a personal boundary is very much like setting up a boundary for other people, except that the consequences tend to be natural consequences. So I'm going to walk you through setting up a personal boundary for myself. And I'm going to use, again, the core value of consistency and also add trustworthiness. So those are two of my core values. I like people to know that I'm trustworthy and consistent. So the boundary that I set up based on those values is that I don't lie to people. Now, that doesn't mean I have to be brutally honest with people. I can communicate to them in an assertive manner while keeping their rights in mind and my rights in mind, but tell them the truth. So consistency and trustworthiness, and the boundary is I don't lie to people. The natural consequence for that is that people won't find me to be trustworthy, and they'll find me to be inconsistent if I lie to them. They will know that they can't depend on me to tell them the truth. And that's a hurtful one, but it would be the natural consequence of me breaking my own boundary. And I communicate that with people, that I will promise to tell them the truth, even if it hurts, because again, I can do it in a compassionate manner. So I communicate it to them, and then the consequences just play out. Now, one thing to keep in mind about consequences is that people tend to give it a negative connotation, that word, consequence or consequences. But that's not necessarily the case. Consequences can be good or bad, and a good consequence of keeping my boundary, my personal boundary with other people, is that they know that they can trust me and they rely on me to tell them the truth. A bad consequence, again, is that they will not trust me. They won't come to me and tell me things. So I hope you found this video on setting boundaries to be useful, and I hope that you'll be able to use the tools, this 5 steps, to be able to set some boundaries of your own. So remember, it is figuring out what your core values are, establishing a boundary or boundaries based on those core values, deciding on a consequence if the boundary is not respected, communicating the boundary and consequences to other people, and then sticking by the consequences. I will see you all next week, and I hope you have a great week.